As my 12-hour overnight sleeper train rode into the city of Wuhan, I can't help but contemplate how much the world has changed since the last time I was here in 2019. This episode is about Wuhan, the city, its culture, history, and importance in modern China. Maybe it's because of the events that took place in the last few years, but I felt an extra sense of anticipation and excitement coming back here. It's a trip that's been a long time in the making, but I'll let the city speak for itself. One of the perks of taking an overnight train is arriving at the destination before the sun is up. And that means you go straight to the famous breakfast spots. Wuhan is known for authentic breakfast streets that locals have frequented and gathered in for decades, before social media influencers made them into tourist spots. The entire street you see here is lined with shops, eateries, and of course traffic. These streets were designed for an era when the primary transportation method were bicycles and your feet. The vendors here support surrounding entire communities of tens of thousands of residents who go out every morning for fresh supplies. This particular eatery is very famous, amplified by young social media stars who flock here, and every morning starting at the crack of dawn, the line stretches down the block. When you get to the front of the line, you realize the power of specialization. They only sell one thing: a fried dough inside of another fried dough that is unique to this city, to this one store. For me, it was more about the experience of visiting this place and this street than the food itself, of how one simple store can sell more than 1 million identical fried dough a year with just a dozen employees. But of course, there were plenty of authentic local food that did not have long lines. Over the course of my 5 days here, I realized that it's possible to visit Wuhan without stepping foot inside a large restaurant, that there were vendors, stalls, and eatery streets throughout the city. The food was not too different from that of the rest of China's, but truly authentic local food seemed to have a special emphasis on using dough. This one was particularly memorable and delicious. An oven-baked dough stuffed with beef and pork fillings, cilantro, hot peppers, and lettuce. I had to go back for seconds. With my belly full, I began to explore the streets of Wuhan, starting away from the crowded commercial centers, but deep into the residential areas where you can find authentic local life. The pace of development in China has been staggering in the past 50 years, and you'll find no shortage of neon-lit skyscrapers, extravagant malls throughout all major cities, and here's no exception. But I fall in love with these everyday buildings, homes, and businesses that regular folks dwell in. Everywhere in the city, you'll find buildings from the 70s, 80s, and 90s still standing and in use. They reflect a time when budgets were much more limited, when practicality and Soviet styles trumped architectural aesthetics, and when people simply needed a roof over their heads. Many of the modern amenities we're used to today, such as underground parking or elevators, are missing. Yet as time slowly moves along, our pace of life seemingly gets faster, And these buildings today somehow exude a nostalgic and romantic feeling. Perhaps this is why so many commercial streets nowadays are set in these older neighborhoods. Who really knows? But walking through them, found throughout Wuhan, reminds me to slow down in life and take a breather. Wuhan is the provincial capital of Hubei Province, a city with more than 11 million inhabitants and one of the most important transportation hubs for the entire country because it sits along the Yangtze River that divides China into northern and southern halves. Wuhan is not the only prominent Chinese metropolis that sits on either side of the Yangtze. Other prominent cities are Nanjing and Chongqing. But perhaps no city has the geographical advantage Wuhan enjoys sitting perfectly midstream, which explains why every day hundreds of container ships traverse its waters. Cargo rail cars arrive at its stations, and I found that for less than 20 cents, I too can cruise the Yangtze on one of the many daily ferries crossing the river. Even today, with one of the most well-built subway systems in the country, including underwater subway tunnels, ferries still transport local residents both on foot or on their mopeds from one shore of the river to the other. We have convincingly conquered the challenge of navigating rivers. In fact, these ferries have become popular tourist attractions, and by evening time, especially during hot summer days, it's standing room only both on the deck and inside. But it was not always the case that Wuhan and China as a whole had solved the riddle of crossing the Yangtze River, one of the two Chinese mother rivers that accompany the birth and evolution of the Chinese civilization. This brings us to the Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge, completed in 1957, and its historical significance as the first bridge to ever be constructed across the Yangtze anywhere in the country. It may not look like much today architecturally. In fact, there are 10 other bridges just in Wuhan alone that cross the Yangtze, and dozens more elsewhere in the country. But this bridge's place in history is second to none. Before its completion in 1957, for someone to move from the northern half of the country to the southern half, for example, from Beijing to Guangzhou, you'd be facing a boat ride right where I stand. This is especially inconvenient for train travel and consequently the flow of goods domestically. As I walk on this 1 mile long bridge today, a second deck below me is transporting both passengers and cargo trains every few minutes. And observing the various architectural elements of this historically significant structure, it is easy to see that this bridge is from a bygone era. At the time, China's steel production was nearly non-existent, so the bridge structure is primarily made from cement. Contrast that with the beautiful Yingwuzhou Yangtze River Bridge, opened in 2014, where little cement was used and modern high-strength steel make up what is one of the longest suspension bridges in the world today. And you can see how far the country has come. Nonetheless, while the original may be showing its age, after almost 70 years of service, it still faithfully serves the city of Wuhan and transports millions of people every single year. from the top of the Yangtze River Bridge, one can see the small but clear Yellow Crane Tower far in the distance. If there's one cultural icon that represents Wuhan, or even the entire Hubei Province, it is the famous Yellow Crane Tower. To come to Wuhan without seeing it will be the same as if one visited New York City without stopping by Times Square or going to Vegas for the first time and skipping the Strip. The tower was completed exactly 1,800 years ago in the year 223. But what you see today is a modern construction that sits at the shore of the Yangtze, completed in 1985, as the original tower has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times in the past 1,800 years. It's famous first because of its long age. Second, because of its association with this historically important city that has turned into a modern megacity today. And lastly, because of the great historical poets who have visited and climbed its steps and left lasting verses for posterity. The great Chinese poet Li Bai is one such Tang Dynasty poet who, during his travels throughout China, left us the following verses. My old friend bids farewell to me in the west at Yellow Crane Tower. Amid March's mist and flowers, he goes down to Yangzhou. The distant image of his lonely sail disappears in the blue sky, and all I can see is the Yangtze River flowing to the edge of sky. In 2019, I have visited and climbed the Yellow Crane Tower during the day. This time, I purchased a ticket for the night viewing and climbing experience after hearing that the daily night and laser show is spectacular. On my way inside and on the way to the top, I am reminded again and again of the great age and tradition of this historical site. And standing at the top, looking out to the city, as in the words of Li Bai's poem, amid March's mist, and I was truly here in March, I can only wonder what the Tang Dynasty poet would think of the city today if he were to see it with his own eyes. What poems would he write about it today? I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the beautiful city of Wuhan. The real reason I've come here to the city during a cold and misty week in late March is to catch a glimpse of the most famous Chinese sakura. That's right, Wuhan is the site of the most beautiful and well-known cherry blossom in all of China on the campus of Wuhan University. It was a hard ticket to get in, very limited quantities, given that the entry to the university campus is restricted so as to not disturb the daily lives of the students and faculty, but I managed. And that's where we will go together in the next episode. See you there.